Ashwin Sanghi was included by Forbes India in their Celebrity 100 and is a winner of the Crossword Popular Choice Award. I think that calls for an applause. Yes. Our first discussion for the day, Mr. Tino. He is the first chairman of the Real Estate Regulatory Authority of Madhya Pradesh. He has been Chief Secretary of the State of Madhya Pradesh from 2013 up to his retirement in 2017. In the central government, he has served as Director in the Ministry of Environment and Forest, Controller of Bhabha Atomic Research Center in Mumbai. He has also served in the United Nations for 5 years as Director of the UNIDO Center for South Industrial Cooperation. Our second discussion for the session, Mr. Raghav Chandra. He is the President of the Society for Culture and Environment and Director of the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival. From the IAS, he has been the Secretary Government of India and before that, Chairman, National Highways Authority of India. He has written extensively on management and infrastructure issues and he has a master's degree from Delhi University and Howard University, USA. Let us initiate them the session with a thunderous round of applause.
Thank you so much. Many of the things that I wanted to say about Ashwin have already been said. He is perhaps not just one of the, but the highest selling author in India of fiction. And the list of books that were read out and some were left out, all of them, I think apart from Rosabal line, all of them have this magnificent alliterative ring to them, you know, Chanakya's chant, Krishna's key, the Krishna key, Sialkot saga, Keepers of the Kal Chakra, and now his latest, the Vault of Vishnu, which is, soon to be launched, I think, Ashwin, in Jaipur.
So I must get in a plug. For those of you who haven't heard about the book, it's available on Amazon for pre-order. So this is the Banya side of me, Raghavji. So please do go and pre-order.
Ashwin is talking about his Banya side, but you know, along with the business, with his business, when he began, I think now you're probably a full-time writer, you don't have time for anything else, but his first book came out when I think you were 36 or 37, and became a bestseller immediately, so that's something marvelous. About the books also that were mentioned, Ashwin writes, has co-authored 2 books with James Patterson, and I remember reading the first one, Private India, 5 years ago, and Ashwin's popularity can be judged by the fact that when I read that book 5 years ago, James Patterson's name was in 1-inch letters, and Ashwin Sanghi's name, I think, in 1/3 or 1/4 inch down. And as these editions have been going on sale, now Ashwin Sanghi's name is in 1-inch letters and James Patterson's name is in small letters down. So that really, and you know an author has arrived when the name of the book is in smaller size letters than the name of the author. So, because people buy it now because it's Ashwin Sanghi and not because it's called something or the other.
Tino, you're damn good for my ego. You're so good for my ego.
Why am I saying all these?
I hope I'm still in the room. I feel as I'm floating somewhere.
But why am I saying all these nice things about Ashwin? Because everyone likes to bask in reflected glory, and we come from the same college, though Ashwin is 10 years my junior. So, with this introduction, one more thing which was left out. Ashwin not only writes fiction and co-authors fiction, but he also writes non-fiction. His first one, 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck, and that was then followed by Bloody Good Health and Bloody Good Wealth and I don't know, Bloody Good Parenting and
Bloody Good Everything.
Bloody Good Marks and Bloody Good Everything. So we'll talk about those also later. I will invite Raghav to lead. Or would you like to say something, Ashwin, before Raghav asks his first question?
No, why should I spoil the atmosphere? I'm basking in glory.
So, after that brilliant introduction by Tino, Lisa, Ashwini, I would like to go down to your books, and you've written these fabulous, thrillers, conspiracy theory thrillers, Rosabelle Line, Chanakya's Chant, Krishna Ki, Sialkot Saga, and the Keepers of the Kal Chakra. So you're like somebody who is going like a time machine, going across time from ancient times to time immemorial to the Middle Ages to current times, and you've brought in terrorism. You've starting with seals that have not been broken and scripts that have not been deciphered, to the life of Jesus Christ, to the Middle Ages, to the current times, and to absolutely thrilling plots. So you go across time, you go span across geographies, it's not restricted to one particular place, and the plots are extremely gripping. But there is something which is unique to them, and that is that they are all embedded in Hindu mythology. So what I'd like to know from you is, what was the trigger point? I mean, what was it that you read first as a child? And I'm sure you must have been one of those absolutely, naughty kids who was fascinated by Amar Chitra Katha, by all the little stories that we read about Ram, Krishna, gods from the Bhagavad Puran and so on. But what is it that specifically that you recall that triggered your interest in using Hindu mythology as a key and as a basic instrument for your conspiracy theory plots?
Well, honestly, I must tell you that the starting point was a lot before I actually became a writer. The starting point was at that moment of time when I was training. I grew up in a typical Marwadi Banya family. So, I mean, the two most important words that are taught to a child in a Marwadi family are debit and credit. So I grew up in that sort of a culture where the only environment around you was a business environment. At age 12, I was sent to my father's daftar, where there was a Munimji, and he used to teach me bookkeeping and how to maintain the Bahi Khata. But in parallel to that life was the life of reading. And that came to me from my Nanaji, who lived in Kanpur. And Nanaji ki bahut badi library thi. He had about, I think, 6,000-8,000 books. And every week, he would send me one book out of that library, lovingly picked by him, that I think this is a book which is worth reading.
These were in English?
These were English books. And I remember receiving books which were way ahead of my years in that sense. I remember trying to read autobiography of a yogi when I was probably 14 and giving up on it, and then eventually again going back to it. When I would go to my father's office, there was Munimji who would look at my book in my hand and he would say, why are you wasting your time with this? Bookkeeping is far more important than book reading, And if you must read, then read a balance sheet, for God's sake. But ye sab kya kar rahe ho? And I would go back to Nanaji and I would say, Nanaji, ye Munimji, ye sab kehte hain. So Nanaji had this very wonderful, wise way of being able to encapsulate everything in a few words. And he would say that, beta, see, you are in a Marwadi business family, so you are always going to worship Lakshmi. That is always going to be the center of your life. He said, but you know what? Lakshmi without Saraswati is of very little use. He said, the relationship between Lakshmi and Saraswati is a very unique one. He said that if Lakshmi and Saraswati, it's Lakshmi who tends to be much more curious about where Saraswati is. If Saraswati is in this room, then Lakshmi wants to be in this room. If Saraswati gets up and leaves this room, then Lakshmi also wants to get up and find out where has Saraswati gone. And he said the best way is if you can get both of these Devijis to be there. And he said the only Hindu deity that can keep both these Devijis together is Ganesh, who is presented in the middle. which probably explains why I look the way I do. Because it's been a lifelong quest. And as of right now, my Lakshmi Saraswati are sitting right now. And somehow or the other, I think that fundamental wisdom that Nanaji imparted, during his lifetime, he sent me a little over 400 books. And that somewhere along the way, it was getting imbibed in me. But the trigger, as it were, came much, much later. I had already got involved fully in business, and I was doing my own typical business thing, 16 hours a day. And then suddenly there was a family wedding happening in Srinagar, and I ended up for 2 days in Srinagar. And on the second day, I had a little time to spare, and I told the driver, I said, please get me out of this godforsaken hotel and take me to any interesting place. This was the year 2002. And he took me for the first time to this little tomb known as Rosa Bal. And Rosa Bal, the common folklore around it, is that it is the final resting place of Christ. There is a body buried there. It is a Muslim Pir. His name is Nasiruddin. And he is buried there from roughly the 13th, 14th century. And that, of course, is a burial with the head pointing towards Mecca. But underneath the body of Nasiruddin is an earlier burial. And of course, property records indicate that tomb has stood there from 124 AD, so roughly 2000 years ago. Outside the tomb is a metallic plate which shows 2 human feet, the left and the right, with little cross marks indicating the points at which the nails for a crucifixion would have been hammered. And my good friend Amish Tripathi always says, Ashwin, stop going out to look for stories because stories will come looking for you. And actually that's what had happened. The story had come looking for me. And I was obsessed by it. So I ended up spending the next 1.5 or 2 years trying to read up everything, and I had no intention of writing a book. I just wanted to know about that story, connect the dots. At the end of that 1.5 or 2 years, I think I was rather knowledgeable on that topic. And I started writing a thesis, a 40-page non-fiction document explaining how those dots could be connected, what were the theories. And at the end of that period, I gave it to my wife and I said, read it and tell me how it sounds. And the next morning she said, congratulations, Ashwin. So I was like, oh, wow, that means you liked it. She said, no, I think you have discovered the cure for insomnia, dear. 2 pages and I was out for the count. I'm going to read it every night because it helps me sleep. And she said, who's going to read this? You have to make this into a story. And that's how the Rosabal line was born. So that was the real trigger. But actually the inception was Nanaji.
But it was Lakshmi who got you triggered.
Absolutely.
The Lakshmi in the house.
Ashwin, here's one Saraswati who's on the border of looking like Ganesh. But anyway, talking about the Rosabal line. Ashwin, you wrote somewhere on your blog that it received 47 rejections. People were not ready to print it. And then finally you self-published.
Yes.
And under the name of Sean Higgins.
Yes.
Why did you think it necessary to use a pseudonym?
Sure.
And why did you choose this pseudonym?
Okay. The rejections were coming in over a period of almost about, you could say, close to around 2 years, because I finished writing the book in early 2005. And by the time I was actually, by the time I self-published it, it was 2007. So it was about 2 years and odd. And that included literary agents as well as publishers who were saying thank you and no thank you. And in front of my desk I had a bulletin board on which there were some numbers written. People used to wonder what those numbers were. But 12, 18, 30, 33, 38 were the numbers on that. And people used to ask me, what are those numbers? I said, well, 12 was the number of times that Harry Potter's first book was rejected. The first J.K. Rowling book in that series. And 18 was the number of times that Jonathan Livingston Seagull was rejected. And 30 was the number of times that Stephen King's first book, Carrie, was rejected. and 33 was the number of times that Chicken Soup for the Soul was rejected, and 38 was the number of times that Gone with the Wind was rejected. So actually, in some ways, I had psyched myself into almost competing with them that who can get more rejections. And you have to find ways to sort of cope with that rejection game which is happening. Eventually, when, at some point of time, I realized that this wasn't happening, and I was just fed up of that entire process. My wife and I used to love playing Scrabble, so we were playing Scrabble one day, and I thought to myself, I told my wife, in fact, I said, Anu, मेरे नाम में ही कुछ खोट है. वो अश्विन सांघी का नाम पढ़ के ही they have a problem with me. So she said, okay, but then change the name. So I laid out all the letters of Ashwin Sanghi on a Scrabble board, and I started shuffling them around to see how many anagrams could I create with those 12 letters of Ashwin Sanghi. And the first complete one, which sounded complete, sort of very sensible, it sounded like a name, was Sean Higgins. And so I said, okay, Sean Higgins it is, that's fine. As it turns out, by the time the book got self-published, and then a year later, Westland came along and said that we want to publish it. And Gautam Padmanabhan, who was the publisher at that time and continues to remain the publisher at Westland, now a very dear friend, he said that Ashwin, see, you will have to get rid of this anagram from the cover of the book. I said, why? I'm very happy with the way it is. I'm not looking for personal fame or publicity. And he said, just imagine that we hold a press conference for Mr. Sean Higgins. The press comes looking for Mr. Sean Higgins, and then we have you sitting there and saying, I'm Sean Higgins. He said, it's going to be a culture shock. We're going to be the laughing stock. Please get rid of this name. So the first murder that happens in Ashwin Sanghi books is of Sean Higgins.
Ashwin, you've been called the Dan Brown of India, and I think soon Dan Brown will be called the Ashwin Sanghi of whatever. But anyway, M.V. Kamath said about your books, or I think about Rosabal line, or maybe
it was
some
about
of them.
Rosabal.
Yeah. What is truth? He said, the same question that Pilate asked Jesus. And he says this can be asked, what is truth can be asked both in jest and also in all seriousness. But Ashwin Sanghi won't pause for an answer. Now tell me, do you think that with your successive books, you also face that same conundrum that Dan Brown faces? In the sense, when Dan Brown first came out with Da Vinci Code, it was, created a huge furor all over the world, and people wondering, is it true, is it not true, what is it not? But then when he came out with 2, 3, 4 of his, similar thrillers, then everybody said, no, these are all made up, and then none of the others are as famous as that.
Of course.
Now, do you think that with every successive book of yours, you would also face the same kind of dilemma?
Sure. Tino, I'll tell you, the issue really is that, first of all, I myself am confused by the notion of truth. Because to a certain extent, we tend to believe that history is factual, and we believe that myth is fantasy. We've also got distinct boxes in our scriptures, Itihas and Puran. Itihas as it happened, and Puran, very old times, fantastical tales. But we see a lot of overlap between Itihas and Puran. So, in the Mahabharata and Ramayana, you have fantastical tales, even though they are considered as Itihas. And on the other hand, in the Purans, you have actual lineages of kings and dynasties, even though they are considered fantastical tales. So can one really consider, when I was writing Chanakya's chant, for example, the Arthashastra we know was written by the great Kautilya, but very little is written about Kautilya. So for actually looking at Kautilya's life story for the purpose of a novel, one has to go back and read a Sanskrit play known as the Mudra Rakshas. And the Mudra Rakshas, which is by Vishaka Datta, almost 700 years after Kautilya's life. And in fact written as a play to be performed on stage. So what if Vishaka Datta was an ancient day Ashwin Sanghi, taking fact and fiction and mixing them in order to create an interesting story? But that has now become de facto history. That now we don't question the life of Chanakya. So in that sense, I tend to believe George Santana, who says that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. So history, I tend to take it not with a pinch of salt, but with a bag of salt. On the other hand, myth, you have someone like C.S. Lewis who says that a myth is a lie that reveals a truth. So in other words, look for the deeper truth in the myth. So in that sense, I believe that myth is being far more honest, even with its lies. When I had just launched the Roosevelt line and I had my first press conference, a young press reporter, a cheeky fellow, decided to get up and he said that you're a businessman with 15 years of training, with an MBA in finance. One day you decide that you're going to write a theological thriller. What gives you the qualifications to be able to write this book? And I said, during my growing up years, my mother always used to tell me that I was a bloody good liar. I could tell a lie with a straight face. And you wouldn't pick up on the lie. And that's what we do as novelists. What we are doing is we are taking fact, and then the fact is the two layers, the two pieces of bread of the sandwich. And then we layer it with fiction. And the idea is basically that you don't know when you're reading fact and when you're reading fiction, which means that it throws up that very delicious question, which is what if? What if this were true? What if Jesus Christ is actually buried in Srinagar? What if the Mahabharata war did occur? What if the Saraswati dried up and contains some secrets that we don't know about? That is the starting point of conspiracy fiction. And that is pretty much what I do. So I have always believed that what I do is I take two words, myth and history, and I put them into a particle collider like CERN. And I bring those two words charging and hurtling towards one another at very, very high speed. And hopefully, when they collide with one another, then myth plus history becomes a mystery. That's what I try to do.
Wonderful. Ashwin, let me ask you a question about the process of collaborative writing. I'm the kind of person who finds it difficult to write even the minutes of a meeting if I've got to write it along with somebody else, unless I have full control of that.
But you're a fiction writer also, right?
Well,
so that should help with minutes.
no, but if I'm writing
they are
them
about
alone,
events that never happened, or discussions that never took place.
if I'm writing them alone, fine. But how do you, when you write a book with James Patterson, and what is that? What is the process? And particularly your two books, Private India and Private Delhi. Did you first write it, and then give him the draft, or does he make the outline? Who makes the plot? How does this happen? it's...
James is prolific. For those of you who may not be familiar with his name, that's actually just a quirk, because he's not that famous as, let's say, a Dan Brown or a Jeffrey Archer in India. But if you look at the US, for example, he is consistently the #1 selling author in the US market.
Stephen King?
Absolutely. In fact, in the world, James actually outsells everyone else. Last year, just as a Bania fact, last year, James Patterson's royalty check was about $90 million US. So the guy is a book factory, and he has perfected this art of collaboration. Because he turns out anywhere between 10 and 12 books a year. So that you can't do without a collaboration process.
So I'll just add to what Tino's asked, and when you collaborate with somebody like James Patterson, was it he who approached you, and I'm sure he approached you, what were the questions that went into your mind when he asked you to collaborate? Were you just excited and thrilled?
No, I must tell you,
or were you wary that here was somebody who was using you because he likes to churn out a book every 6 months or 8 months? I mean, for him it's like
actually it's almost every month.
Every month,
yeah.
and so
10
the quality.
books a year.
So when you want to produce something with that rapidity and speed, the quality gets compromised.
Yeah. So
what were the thoughts that went?
Well, frankly, there wasn't too much thinking process because the marriage between James Patterson and Ashwin Sanghi for those thrillers was what is called an arranged marriage in India. In the sense that my publisher, who used to be based out of Delhi, shifted to the UK, and she was working out of an office which was next to James Patterson's publisher in London. And the two ladies sat for lunch together, and one of them said, James wants to now write a thriller in India. And my friend said that, oh, I have a thriller writer in India who would be just right. So it was gutta gutti type of situation. Ladka ladki, matlab, everything was set. And we were simply informed post facto that, listen guys, we think that this would be a great collaboration. Now, of course, nowadays an arranged marriage still implies that you will still be told, listen, you can go out a few times and see. So James and I Skyped a few times to figure out.
So this kind of arranged marriage, how does the division of spoils or royalties take place?
So the way it works really is that James usually has a method where he writes out a detailed plot outline which will run into 30 or 40 pages. And then he expects you to actually write out the first draft of the manuscript based on his plot outline. But when it came down to India, what James he flipped the model around. And he said, listen, I am not that familiar with this whole Indian game. And I think I will be not taking full advantage of you if I give you a plot outline which is set in India. Instead, let the plot outline come from you. So I ended up writing the plot outline. There were lots of amendments back and forth between myself and James. And then after that, the first draft was written by James, which otherwise I would have been doing. And then the second draft was written by me. And then that entire process got reversed by the time we went into the second novel, which was Private Day, where the plot outline came from him, the first draft was written by me, and then the second draft was written by James.
And who gave those very, very quirky names? Nimbu Baba. Nimbu Baba, for instance.
So that was Ashwin. That was Ashwin.
Call this guy Lemon Fellow or something. Anyway, but did you find it difficult to do that, or did you find it frustrating at times, or?
Not at all. I'll tell you, the problem is when you have two authors who are basically speaking the same language. I think the sensibility of a James Patterson is broad brushstrokes. He's really a big picture guy. If he can convey an entire chapter in 2 paragraphs, he will do it and he'll go on to the next chapter. Whereas an Ashwin Sanghi believes that typically 1,000 words to 1,500 words is a respectable number of words for a chapter before I move to the next. Typically, with a James, if the manuscript goes to him, he'll say, listen, why has a murder not happened in the first 3 pages? Let's have some blood here. We need some fresh blood in the first 3 pages. If I'm building up on the relationship between a woman and a man, he'll say, why is this taking so many pages to happen? Let them get together in bed by chapter 3. So the point is, his sensibilities are wham bam, thank you ma'am. Get it done. On the other hand, I'm the sort of person, I like to build up the atmosphere. I like to build up the suspense. And I like to, let the unanswered questions linger for a longer period of time. And that really works in a collaboration where you have two people of slightly different sensibilities, because then they are actually adding into that collaborative process. Otherwise, they are both singing. I mean, ultimately, when you have a choir, it's because they are singing in different octaves that you eventually have a harmony. So I think that was it.
Ashwin, your books are so fact-packed, and one wonders from where you get all this. And I heard you actually speak about the process at the Delhi Lit Fest, but I'm sure that our audience here would love to hear about your email account. So if you can tell us about that, that'll be interesting.
So, in this audience, there is Kiran Mandral who's sitting. And Kiran, of course, Kiran and I have done panel sessions very many times. And she has asked me a set of questions to which I have responded in the past.
Kiran, you
But
can wave off
every
your
time-
hand so that others can see you. And
Every time, my answer tends to vary a little bit because of the fact that I'm a fiction writer. So I'm a little concerned that she's going to catch me out on this. But the process for me is very simple. It always starts with the germ of an idea. And ideas can happen at any time. You don't sit down and think about an idea when you're actually getting down to writing a novel. The ideas can happen anytime in life. So I have, since the year 2006 or 7, when was Gmail started? 2005. So from 2006 onwards, I have always maintained an email ID, which is a very complicated email ID, which is not given to anyone else. It is only for me to email myself. So I email myself a few times in the day, and which is basically that I could be sitting here and let's say Raghav ji asks me a question which I find that it contained a nugget which was very interesting, and I email myself that this was asked, and or I'm traveling down the street and I see a site which is interesting. I'll take a pic and I'll email myself. Or I'm reading a book, I'll take a pic of the page and I'll email myself. Or a web link or a video. Over the years, I've ended up emailing myself about 10 or 12,000 times.
Wow.
And that is my idea bank. So whenever I need to now look at a novel, I go back to the idea bank and I see which are the most interesting ones that I could look at. And of course, from that idea bank, then there will always be a trigger. In the case of, for example, Chanakya's chant, the trigger was sitting in, I think it was UPA 2 that was coming into power 2009, and Karunanidhi ji had just landed up in Delhi to meet Sonia Gandhi, and he left in a huff without the government having got formed. And I thought to myself, I said, it's been several weeks since elections happened, and we still don't have a government. Was politics always so messy? And Chanakya's chant was a question to talk about the good old times, that the good old times weren't really that good, that politics was always politics. Or for example, the Krishna key. I had gone for a get-together where I ended up meeting with this person who was, for lack of a better word, royally inebriated. And he genuinely believed that he was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu. And next morning, luckily for me, Tino, I was also 5 drinks down. So the story resonated. And the next morning, I called for an English translation of the Kalki Puran, which I read, and that's how the Krishna key came up. So there's always a trigger which will lead to that. Then typically about a year or so in terms of research. So for example, I've spent the better part of 2 months this year in China because the vault of Vishnu, one half of the story is set in China. So typically the research period can be anywhere between 10 and 12 months. 3 months is the plotting, where I typically try and put down every twist and turn in the plot. Normally it runs chapter-wise. And my plots are always on Excel spreadsheets. So every chapter is a row which talks about who the main characters are, when it's set, what is the backdrop, and what is the twist at the end of the chapter, what is the hook. And then finally, the remaining last 9 months is towards actually writing and editing and rewriting and polishing till the time that you go into production.
So 2 takeaways for all aspiring writers. Email yourself and have 5 drinks at a party.
Oh yeah, whenever you have writer's block, remember one thing, that there is no writer's block that a peg of whiskey does not cure.
So, Tino,
Yes.
so Ashwin, you're living in Bombay or Mumbai, which is the seat of Indian cinema, and we've seen a lot of books getting converted into very, very famous films.
Sure.
Which of your books is going to get converted into Netflix series, which into regular commercial films, and how is your liaison with the film industry, and do they in any way influence your plots? The desire, because I find that Chetan Bhagat, for instance, all his books get picked up for films,
Yeah.
and which leads one to the suspicion that some of us as authors might actually be driving ourselves around to write something which will get picked up for film. So is that A, a consideration, and B, which of your books have been converted into films for benefit of our audience?
For those who have read the Roosevelt line, I was once at a college event, and someone who had read the Roosevelt line, he got up very seriously and he asked me, he said, "Sir, can I ask you a serious question?" I said, "Sure, I'll try and answer it seriously also." And he said, "I want to know what type of weed do you smoke when you write a book like the Roosevelt line?" It is such a convoluted plot. It is completely twisted. And if I was writing for cinema, I wouldn't even dream of writing it that way. So frankly, the reason why you've still not seen an adaptation of an Ashwin Sanghi book into a series or into film is simply because it is so difficult to adapt. Having said that, I have signed multiple option agreements on multiple books with multiple producers and directors. Unfortunately, once they eventually sink their teeth into it, a year or 18 months later, they realize that, hey, listen, maybe we took up more than what we bargained for. The great writer Wilbur Smith was in Bombay once, and I asked him, I said, none of my books are getting adapted into film. And he said, "Young man, you stop worrying about it." He said, "I made more money selling the same rights again and again on the books that never got made than the books that actually did get made." So he said, be positive about it. Having said that, today the status, the way it stands, my novel, The Krishna Key, is with Eros Entertainment. For currently, the scripting is going on for a movie, and the Sialkot Saga is with the director Hansal Mehta for a OTT series, probably 2 seasons. So that work is currently also ongoing. Chanakya's Chant has been optioned about 4 times till now, but hasn't got made primarily because of the fact that it flips back and forth between past and present, and that's difficult to pull off. So I think from my perspective, when I'm sitting down to write Raghav, I'm not wanting to think in terms of will it get made or not get made. It was the Hollywood director Alfred Hitchcock who said that the length of a movie is related to the endurance of the human bladder. So when you sit for a film, you can only sit there for as long as your bladder will not give way. That's not the case with a book. You can always put it down and get up and go. So that's the difference. We write in a different way, knowing that you're going to use a book over a period of a month or maybe 2 months. And you're going to...
Except that your books are unputdownable.
Thank you. So, frankly, my view has always been that we should not think in terms of us being writers. We should, in fact, particularly for those younger people in this audience who are looking to become thriller writers, your greatest challenge is getting people to turn the page. It's very easy to use fancy words. It's very easy to look up a thesaurus and use a more complicated word than a simple one. When I'm having discussions with my editor, typically when I'll send a manuscript to her, she will particularly look at the word said, and she'll change that to he remarked, she observed, he thought, she pondered, she reacted, and then when it comes back to me, I again change it back to said, he said, she said, he said, she said. And she says, why do you do this? And I said, it's unimportant as to what happens. Those words, he said and she said, is so utterly irrelevant. What's within those inverted commas, within the quotes, that's important, and that's what's keeping the story going. So get the person to turn the page. Attention spans are the biggest issue today. We've got declining attention spans, and when you're reading a book, you still have your mobile going off. And of course, now we are competing with the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime. So getting people to turn the page and stick it out with the book is very difficult work. And that's your most important challenge as a thriller writer.
We can take questions from the audience. A couple of questions. Yeah.
Writer.
Lovely.
My question is, what are the ethics of writing about historical figures?
Sure. We have a great event known as the Great Rebellion of 1857. But if you look at this event, is not even taught in England in the normal history curriculum. But if you are a history major, then you will read about it as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. It's the same event, but two completely different spins on that event. So in that sense, I begin to wonder as to how much of our historical information can we actually treat as the unadulterated truth. Think about this. In our Hindu scriptures, we consider the Ramayana to be itihas. In other words, we consider it to be history. But the Ramayana itself, we have 300 versions of the Ramayana. So if you look at, let's say, the Tulsi Ramayana, the Tulsi Ramayana makes Ram into God. He's an avatar of Vishnu. Valmiki's Ramayana treats Ram as an ordinary human being. We have versions like, for example, let's say the Adbhut Ramayana, in which actually it is Sita who manifests as Durga and kills Ravan. We have the Anand Ramayana, in which actually the abduction of Sita does not take place. We have versions like the Lao Ramayana, in which Ram is a Bodhisattva. We have the Muslim Ramayana, in which Ram is a Sultan. So the question that arises is, which of these Ramayans is itihas? So the process of retelling our narratives is a process that we have imbibed over centuries. So I don't see it as something different. Yes, I do believe that it is our responsibility that if we are writing in the realm of fiction, then we should make it abundantly clear that this is fiction. So I think when the original problem occurred with the Da Vinci Code, it was primarily because the publishers were attempting to say that this is actually fact. Whereas I have always maintained that my writing is simply fiction that sounds like fact, nothing more. So please read it entirely as fiction. I should be.
Jabra fan of your Bharat series, and most of us are like that.
Thank you so much.
So, as in Sialkot Saga and Keepers of Kalchakra, there were a lot of things to read, and there was a lot of things under the writing. What is new in the vault of Vishnu?
So after the Rosapal line, I have stepped out of my comfort zone, which is India, because I believe that these two very great civilizations, India and China, what we know from ancient times is simply about the advent of Buddhism from China, from India into China. So that is what is talked about. But I'm sure there must have been so much of a cross-mingling of ideas that must have happened, and it could not have been a one-way street, it would have been a two-way street. So the thought I had was that can we go back into those times and see what is it that we picked up from China and what is it that China picked up from India. And so one half of the story is set in modern times in India, and one half of the story is set in ancient China. So I think that is where you will see a departure from my typical Bharat series.
What is your definition of thrillers? Like we were talking about Dan Brown. Dan Brown once said, right, writing thrillers is like making a promise to your readers that I know something that you don't, and I will tell you if you keep going. So what is your definition of thrillers?
No, is simply asking a question in the beginning and answering it by the end. But what do I do when I try and craft a thriller? I like to think of myself as a painter, and I have a canvas. I draw the entire painting down to the last detail. And then after that, I take a paper cutter and I cut up the entire portrait into small pieces. And then I present those pieces to you in a disjointed manner, in a garbled manner. But I give you enough options of being able to put together the jigsaw puzzle by the end. So I want you to make an effort to try and put the jigsaw puzzle together. But if you can't, I will certainly put it together for you by the end. But that's really what, if you really think about it, really thriller writing is all about balancing two very key elements: suspense and surprise. And very few writers around the world have been able to get that perfect balance of surprise and suspense. I'm in this room and suddenly someone gets up and shoots me. That's surprise. But in this room, there is someone lurking that I know about who wants to shoot me. That is suspense. So getting that perfect balance between the two is what thriller writing is all about. And if you really think about it, people think about today Dan Brown, or they think about Stephen King, or they think about Frederick Forsyth and all of these other names. Actually, thriller writing goes back to 1697. And 1697, I believe the first thriller was written, it was called Little Red Riding Hood. Because Little Red Riding Hood has all the elements of both surprise and suspense. The big bad wolf, the walk through the forest, he's stalking her. Actually, it has all the modern elements of a thriller. So, for those who want to be thriller writers, start out by reading Little Red Riding Hood.
So on this happy note, I think there's this young lady there who's been raising her hand. And I think with that we can...
में जिसमें दो पैरेलल स्टोरी चल रही है, एक माइथोलॉजी से रिलेटेड है और दूसरा नॉर्मल लाइफ. तो हाउ यू मेड बैलेंस बिटवीन बोथ स्टोरीज एंड व्हाई यू चूज ओनली माइथोलॉजी?
इतिहास में हो चुका है, जो हमारे पुराण में हो चुका है, जो लिख के लोग चले गए, वो आज के इवेंट्स के साथ कनेक्टेड नहीं है. मेरा मानना है कि जो हिस्ट्री है, जो पास्ट है, वो प्रेजेंट से बहुत ही ज्यादा कनेक्टेड है, और आज का जो प्रेजेंट है वो कल के फ्यूचर से भी कनेक्टेड है. तो मेरी जो जिसे कहते हैं, जहाँ पर मेरा एक्साइटमेंट रहता है, वो ये है कि भाई इन इवेंट्स को मैं कैसे कनेक्ट कर सकता हूँ. तो कई बार ऐसे कनेक्शंस मेरे सामने उभर के आते हैं. जैसे लोग कहते हैं कि भाई जो इब्राहिमिक धर्म है, जैसे क्रिश्चियनिटी, जुडाइज्म, इस्लाम, ये सारे के सारे जो धर्म हैं, ये अलग से डेवलप हुए, और हमारे जो धार्मिक धर्म हैं, जैसे हिंदुइज्म, बुद्धिज्म एंड सो ऑन एंड सो फोर्थ, ये अलग, इनके ट्रैजेक्टरीज, इनके पाथ बिल्कुल अलग थे. पर जब मैं रोजाबाद लाइन लिख रहा था, तो उस वक्त मुझे एक दिन मैं देख रहा था सामने, अगर आप देखिए इस्लाम, क्रिश्चियनिटी, जुडाइज्म, इसका स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट है इब्राहिम. और इब्राहिम में अगर आप वो शब्द इब्राहिम में से जो ए है पहले का, निकाल के उसको एंड में डाल दो तो ब्रह्मा हो जाता है। तो मैं सोचने लगा कि भाई ये इसमें कुछ सत्य है। तो अगर आप बाइबल को पढ़िए तो उसमें इब्राहिम की वाइफ जो है उसका नाम है सारा, और ब्रह्मा जी की जो कंसोर्ट है वो है सरस्वती। तो ये अगेन मेरे माइंड में बैठ गया कि भाई ये क्या है, व्हाट इज इट। सो कई बार जब हम उन कनेक्शंस को देखते हैं, अब मैं हिस्टोरियन नहीं हूं, मैं स्कॉलर नहीं हूं, मैं पंडित नहीं हूं, मैं मौलवी नहीं हूं, तो फ्रैंकली ऑल आई एम is an entertainer. I'm writing paperback thrillers. That's all. पर कई वो ऐसे सवाल जो मैं खड़े करता हूँ, मैं चाहता हूँ कि जो एक्चुअल स्कॉलर्स हैं, जो एक्चुअल रिसर्चर्स हैं, मेरे में वो काबिलियत नहीं है कि मैं उसको रिसर्च ज्यादा कर सकूं। मैं तो सिर्फ आपको एंटरटेन कर रहा हूँ। पर कई ऐसे डिस्कवरी साइंस में हुए जो पहले साइंस फिक्शन में कहे गए कि भाई ये चीज हो सकती है, and then eventually science caught up. I'm hoping that a lot of the concepts that I'm presenting, eventually scholars and theologians and historians might actually start finding value and trying to research it deeper.